They set the tables so nice that night. Napkins folded into triangles, wine glasses sparkling like they hadn't been touched in years, and the roast smelled like something out of a magazine. Laughter danced through the room, and for a moment, Margaret let herself believe everything was just fine. Sarah raised her glass, smiled at her mother with those familiar eyes, and said softly, "Is the $2,000 I send you every month enough, Mom?" Margaret blinked. She smiled even. Then she said it gentle, but confused. "What money?" And she swore to herself that moment changed everything. The forks paused midair. The laughter died without a sound. David's hand tightened around his glass, and Jessica's face drained of every drop of color. You could feel it then like a thread snapping inside the room. One question, one answer, and the truth started to bleed through the silence. Telling this story isn't easy. It still sits heavy in Margaret's chest, like something she hasn't quite finished unpacking. Maybe you've been there, too. Smiling through dinner, nodding through conversations while your heart is quietly breaking. Maybe someone you trusted offered help with one hand while the other was already reaching into your pockets. They don't always come loud. Sometimes they come kindly. And when the truth comes out, it doesn't always come with yelling. Sometimes it arrives on a quiet plate, at a quiet table, in front of the very people who said they'd protect you. The fall. It happened one afternoon, just before the weather turned cold. Margaret was sweeping the front steps like she always did, careful, but maybe too proud to admit she should have asked for help. One minute she was upright thinking about dinner, and the next the world tilted. She remembered the sound her body made against the concrete more than the pain. It was like something inside her cracked before the bone ever did. She broke her hip. They said she was lucky it wasn't worse. Maybe, but luck is strange when you suddenly need help just to sit up straight. The hospital stay wasn't long, but the healing after felt endless. Margaret went from cooking every day to waiting for someone to hand her a glass of water. And when she came home, David stepped in. He and Jessica were kind at first, gentle voices, soft reassurances. "Don't worry about a thing," they said. "We'll take care of the bills, the appointments, all of it. Just rest." Margaret didn't want to argue. She didn't want to be difficult. And truth be told, part of her felt ashamed. She'd always handled things. She'd always been the one to budget every cent, to stretch meals, to pay on time. But that fall made her feel like something in her had slipped, too. She let them help. She let go of the reins. Sarah called when she could. She lives out of town, and Margaret never blamed her for that. She's got her own family, her own life. Still, Sarah made it a point to check in every week and asked what her mother needed. Margaret always told her she was fine, that David and Jessica were handling everything. Sarah said she was sending support each month to help cover groceries and prescriptions. Margaret told her thank you. She told her they were putting it to good use. At least that's what she believed. They all agreed it was best this way. Or so Margaret thought. It made her feel a little less guilty knowing Sarah was doing her part and David and Jessica were managing things at home. It felt like they were still a family pulling together. Margaret didn't know she was being left out of the very decisions that affected her. She didn't know she was the last one to see the truth. She didn't want to be a burden. She just didn't want to fall again. And somehow, while she was learning to walk again, she didn't realize she'd already fallen in a different way into a silence that made it easy for them to take what they wanted without ever asking. The small things. At first, it was little things barely worth noticing. Or so Margaret told herself. The fridge didn't seem as full as it used to be. The leftovers she always counted on for lunch were suddenly smaller, packed into thinner containers. They stopped buying the snacks she liked. No more sweet crackers or the little yogurt cups she used to enjoy in the evenings. When Margaret asked about it, David and Jessica would just smile and say, "We're budgeting, Mom," trying to be smart with spending. Or they'd say they were saving for something big, like a home upgrade or a trip they'd been planning for a while. And Margaret would nod along, pretending it made perfect sense. The lights were off earlier, too. They'd walk through the house, clicking them out behind her like she was wasting something she didn't earn. Margaret would be reading in the living room and suddenly be sitting in the dark because they thought she'd fallen asleep. And the car, They never seemed to have gas when Margaret had a doctor's appointment. They'd sigh, say they'd forgotten to fill up, and she'd wait until the last minute while they figured it out. Margaret started dreading asking for anything, even if it was something small. Then her prescriptions began running short. One month Margaret opened the bottle and knew it wasn't a full refill. She didn't say anything. She told herself maybe the pharmacy made a mistake. But the next month it happened again and again. Margaret started spacing the pills out, trying to stretch what she had. It wasn't safe. She knew that. But she didn't want to be a problem. They were already doing so much. At least that's what she kept telling herself. Margaret stopped asking for extras. No magazines, no new socks, no little things she used to pick up for herself at the store. She told them she didn't need new slippers, even though hers had a tear at the side. She told them the bread was fine, even when it tasted like it had been frozen and thawed twice. She told herself maybe David and Jessica were struggling, too. Maybe this was just what families do when times get hard. But deep down, something didn't feel right. Margaret just couldn't name it yet. It was like a draft coming through a closed window. You can't always see where it's coming from, but you feel it all the same. Margaret wasn't angry then.
Not yet.
She was just quiet and maybe a little ashamed for wondering if the people she trusted were the very ones letting her go without. Doubting herself. There comes a point where you stop trusting your instincts, especially when everyone around you keeps smiling like nothing's wrong. Margaret started thinking maybe she was just tired. Maybe the pills weren't light. Maybe she'd forgotten how many she'd taken. She stood in front of the bathroom cabinet one morning holding the bottle in her hand, trying to remember if she'd already taken one. She stared at the label for a long time. It scared her a little that moment. Not because she thought she was sick, but because she wondered if maybe she really was slipping. Maybe this was just what getting older felt like, watching things slowly blur and not knowing if it's the world or your mind that's fading. Margaret didn't tell anyone. She kept it to herself. She started writing things down in a little notebook, tracking her refills, the dates, what she ate for breakfast. She told herself it was just to stay sharp, just in case. But it was more than that. It was a quiet way of holding on to something. Her memory, her mind, her sense of what was true. Then she saw it. David had left his phone on the kitchen table. The screen lit up, and there it was, an Instagram photo. David and Jessica in Miami standing on a beach, sunglasses on, smiling wide. The caption said something about needing a break, about treating ourselves. Margaret stared at that screen until it went dark. She didn't say a word. When David came back in, she just handed him the phone. He said nothing about it. Neither did she. But Margaret noticed the new watch on his wrist the next day, gold and heavy, something she knew he couldn't afford on his salary. She saw the takeout boxes stacked in the trash, the kind she'd never seen in their house before. She saw the package arrive at the door with designer shoes Jessica ordered, laughing when she opened it like she hadn't a care in the world. And still, Margaret swallowed it. All of it. She told herself she was imagining things. That maybe it wasn't her place to question how they spent their money. That maybe the support Sarah sent had dried up. Maybe they were doing everything with their own money now. Maybe they were tired, too. Maybe she was just being paranoid. It's strange how quickly you can talk yourself out of the truth when you're afraid to face it. Margaret didn't want to believe they'd lie to her. She didn't want to believe the people she loved could smile at her in the morning, then turn around and live like she didn't exist by noon. So, she nodded when they said they couldn't afford to refill all her prescriptions that month. She smiled when they served her half portions and said they were all cutting back. She even said thank you. And then Margaret sat in her room with a notebook in her lap, wondering if the numbers she'd written down were wrong or if maybe she was just too old to read them right. Sarah's visit. It had been a while since Margaret heard her daughter's voice, at least in that way. Sarah called late one afternoon while Margaret was folding towels. She answered, expecting the usual check-in, but this time Sarah's voice had a softness Margaret hadn't heard in months. "I'm coming home, Mama. I miss you."
Just like that.
Like it had been sitting on her chest waiting to be said. Margaret's eyes watered before she could even answer. She told Sarah she couldn't wait, that she'd make her favorite tea and keep the kettle warm. Sarah laughed and said not to fuss. She'd be home soon, and that was enough. When Margaret told David, he looked surprised, almost like he didn't know. Then he nodded and said, "We should have dinner here. Make it nice for her." Jessica agreed. She even started planning the menu right away, listing things off like it was a celebration. Roast chicken, garlic bread, sweet potatoes with brown sugar, the kind of meal you don't make unless company's coming or you've got something to prove. Margaret didn't ask questions. She just smiled, grateful to feel like something good was finally on its way. The day of the dinner came faster than Margaret expected. She heard the clatter in the kitchen early, pots moving, spices hitting the counter, laughter between David and Jessica that felt a little too loud. Margaret stayed in her room for most of the afternoon, trying to stay out of the way, smoothing her hair in the mirror more times than she needed to. She wore the blouse Sarah once said made her eyes look soft. Margaret sat by the window waiting, watching the sun move across the living room floor until she heard the car pull up. Sarah walked in carrying flowers, the kind she used to pick from the field behind her old house when she was little. She hugged her mother tight, longer than usual, and Margaret held her like she didn't want to let go. She could smell the city on Sarah, perfume, train air, something faintly unfamiliar, and it made her realize how long it had been. The question. Dinner was beautiful. The table was set with candles, little folded napkins, even wine glasses they hadn't used in years. They asked Margaret to sit at the head of the table, and for a while, she just listened. Laughter flowed easy. Photos were taken. Sarah's stories filled the room. David was quiet, but Jessica picked up the slack, complimenting the food, talking about how proud they were to have family all together. Margaret nodded, smiled, let it all wash over her like warm light, but something in Sarah's eyes kept tugging at her. She smiled, but it didn't reach all the way. There was a flicker of something behind it. Hesitation, maybe worry. Margaret couldn't place it. But every time Sarah looked at her mother, it was like she was waiting for something. Like there was a question sitting behind her lips that hadn't found its way out yet. And in that moment, sitting there between the roast chicken and the candles, Margaret felt the air start to shift, just a little. She didn't know why yet, but she knew this dinner wasn't just about catching up. There was something else beneath the surface. Something quiet, waiting, and about to speak. They had just finished the second round of food. Plates pushed back slightly. Napkins resting on laps. The kind of fullness that makes a room feel slower, softer. The wine had started to loosen everyone's words. And the stories were spilling out now. Old memories from childhood. Who broke the porch swing? Who burned the biscuits that one Christmas? Margaret leaned back in her chair, watching them all, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. For a moment, she forgot everything else. She just felt present, part of something, part of them. Then Sarah looked at her. She was holding her wine glass, swirling it gently, watching her mother with that same warm smile she had when she used to crawl into bed with Margaret after a nightmare. Margaret smiled back without hesitation. She remembered that clearly. She smiled, and then Sarah said it. "Is the $2,000 I send you every month enough, Mama?" Just like that. Casual, light, like she was checking if Margaret liked the flavor of tea she sent in mail. Margaret blinked. She looked at Sarah, then looked around the table. She felt the shape of the words before she spoke them. But she said them anyway, quiet but certain. "What money?" That's when the room changed. Sarah's smile dropped, not fast, not dramatic, but slowly, like it was melting off her face. David's hand, which had been resting on his glass, tightened. Jessica shifted in her chair, then reached for her napkin, even though her lips were already clean. The laughter from just minutes earlier vanished like someone had blown out all the candles at once. The air felt heavy, but no one moved. No one spoke. It was only then that Margaret noticed the fork. It had fallen from Sarah's hand, barely making a sound against the tablecloth, but it lay there like it meant something. Sarah's eyes didn't leave her mother's.
Not yet.
But Margaret could see her breathing change. Slow, deliberate, and something behind her face, behind all the calm, looked like it was about to break. Margaret sat there still, her heartbeat steady, but hard, like it knew something her mind hadn't caught up to yet. She glanced toward David. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring down at his plate like the mashed potatoes might explain something. Jessica cleared her throat once, then tucked a strand of hair behind her ear twice like that might make the question disappear. But it didn't. The silence that followed didn't stretch. It dropped heavy, sudden. And in that space, every little moment from the past year started to rearrange themselves in Margaret's head. The empty pill bottles, the frozen bread, the new watch, the missed gas money. It all came rushing in like a wave she didn't even know was building. And still Margaret said nothing else. She just sat there with the weight of one simple question now sitting between them like another guest at the table. The confrontation begins. Sarah didn't look at her mother right away. She turned her head slow but sure and fixed her eyes on her brother. Her voice was calm, but there was steel in it. The kind of cold that doesn't come from anger, but from knowing you've been lied to by someone who once shared your childhood. You told me, Sarah said. She didn't want it anymore. David didn't answer at first, just stared at his plate like he was trying to remember how to speak. His mouth opened, then closed again. Then he gave this soft, nervous laugh, like the kind you use when you're caught doing something you think you can talk your way out of. I thought, he started, then shook his head. I mean, we figured it wasn't really necessary anymore. She seemed fine. She seemed fine, Sarah repeated, still looking at him. Is that what you told yourself when you cashed the checks? That's when Jessica jumped in. Her voice was softer, sugar-coated, like she was trying to smooth the edges of something sharp. Maybe it was just a mix-up, she said, looking at Margaret then at Sarah. Maybe the payments didn't go through. Or maybe something got lost in communication. These things happen. But Margaret didn't answer her. She didn't say a word. She just stared first at David, then at Jessica. She watched their faces, not the words, not the excuses, but the way their eyes moved, how their fingers fidgeted, how they couldn't look at her for more than a second at a time. And inside, something began to shift. Margaret felt it. Not a sudden scream or rage, but something quieter, something heavier. The trust she had built over years, the kind that came from late-night fevers, scraped knees, home-cooked meals, and whispered promises. It cracked. Not loud, not dramatic, but clean like glass under pressure. Sarah sat back in her chair, arms crossed now, her lips pressed tight. You could feel the anger beneath her skin, but she didn't raise her voice.
She didn't need to.
Her disappointment filled the space louder than anything else. David reached out, his palm half open like he was about to explain something complicated, something that might make this all make sense. But Margaret didn't want his words. Not then. What could he say? That he thought she'd never notice. That she'd keep taking half portions and skipping medication while they used Sarah's love to fund their dinners and vacations. No, Margaret didn't want explanations. She wanted the truth, but not from their mouths. She wanted it in the silence that followed. In the way they avoided her eyes, in the way they shifted in their chairs like children caught with their hands in something they never earned. Margaret stayed still. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just sat there with her hands resting in her lap, her back straight, and her eyes fixed on the people she once trusted with her comfort, her care, and the pieces of her life she could no longer carry on her own. That's when Margaret knew the truth had been there all along, folded between receipts she never saw and phone calls she never got to hear. It had been growing quietly while she was learning to walk again. And now it was sitting at her table, staring her in the face. Outside. Sarah stood up so suddenly. Her chair slid back against the hardwood with a sound that made everyone flinch. Her voice was different now. No warmth, no hesitation, just a quiet command that didn't need repeating. We're talking outside now. Sarah didn't wait for anyone to answer. She turned and walked straight to the front door. And for a few seconds, no one moved. David looked stunned, like he thought she wouldn't actually say it. Not in front of everyone. Jessica sat frozen, her fork still in her hand, trembling just slightly. Margaret didn't say a word. She pushed her chair back gently, slowly. Her knees ached from sitting too long, but she stood anyway and followed them out. The night air hit Margaret's face like a truth she wasn't ready to breathe in yet. The driveway lights cast long shadows across the cement. Sarah was already standing near the steps, arms crossed, waiting for them. David and Jessica came out last, David first, then Jessica behind him. Her arms wrapped around herself, like the chill in the air had just found her. But it wasn't the weather. It was what she knew was coming. Sarah turned to face them, her eyes sharper than Margaret had seen since she was a teenager standing up to someone twice her size. Sarah pointed at David, and her voice didn't shake. "You told me," she said, "she didn't need the money, that she wanted you to use it for things she couldn't handle herself. You said she insisted. I believed you." David tried to respond, but Sarah didn't give him space. "You've been stealing from her for almost 2 years." Her voice cracked slightly on that last word, but it wasn't weakness. It was fury wrapped in heartbreak. David's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. "It wasn't stealing," he said, as if saying it out loud might make it true. "We were helping. We were just keeping things simple." Sarah laughed once, bitter, quiet, like something inside her had snapped. "Simple?" she asked, while she cut pills in half and pretended she wasn't hungry. "While you posted vacation photos and wore a new watch to dinner, while she sat in the dark because you told her the power bill was too high." Jessica stepped forward, her voice trembling. "It wasn't like that. We just thought it made sense to keep it all together. We didn't use it for anything crazy." "You used it for everything but her," Sarah said, sharp and steady. "You let her go without while I kept sending money thinking I was helping. You lied to both of us." Margaret stood to the side, close enough to hear everything, but far enough to watch them clearly, like she was seeing them for the first time with no blur, no haze of love or obligation in the way. And she realized then all the small moments she had ignored hadn't been small at all. They were parts of a story she hadn't been allowed to read until now. David looked down at the ground. He didn't argue anymore. Jessica turned her face away, like the shadows might hide her from what she had done. And Margaret just stood there quiet, steady, the same way she did the day she learned how to walk again after her fall, because she knew this wasn't the end of the conversation. This was just where the storm began to speak. Margaret's words. Margaret stood there for a long moment, just listening. The night around them had gone still. No wind, no passing cars, not even the soft hum of crickets, just the raw quiet that falls when truth has been spoken and no one dares to move. Sarah's voice had already carved through the air like a blade. But what needed to be said next? It had to come from Margaret. She stepped forward slowly. Her knees ached, but she didn't lean on anything. She didn't need to. Not anymore. She looked at David. Her son, the boy she raised with tired hands and sleepless nights. The one who used to fall asleep in her arms and call her his whole world. She looked at Jessica, the same one she welcomed into her house like her own, fed from her table, trusted to care for her when she couldn't lift the laundry basket without wincing. And Margaret let the silence hold one more breath before she finally spoke. "I trusted you," she said. "I let you into my home, not because I was weak, but because I believed you'd do right by me, and you used me like a checkbook with a soft voice." David's eyes welled up. Margaret saw the tears coming, the ones he thought might buy back some of what he lost. But she didn't stop. "Not now. You sat at my table. You listened to my prayers. You watched me ration medicine and still told me we couldn't afford more. And all that time, you let me believe it was life being hard, not you being cruel." David looked like he wanted to say something, but no words came. Jessica clutched his arm like he might collapse. But Margaret wasn't finished. "You didn't just steal money. You stole my peace. You took the part of me that once slept without fear, that once believed I was safe in my own home. Do you know what it feels like to watch someone you love walk through your life with quiet hands, taking things you can't get back?" Margaret's voice didn't rise. It didn't shake. She let each word fall exactly where it belonged, measured and certain. "There were days I thought I was losing my mind, that maybe I was too old, too forgetful. But I wasn't. I was just too kind, and you counted on that." David's tears came then running fast down his face, but Margaret didn't move to wipe them. She stood her ground, steady and sure. "I won't shout. I won't throw you out with noise. That's not who I am. But don't confuse my quiet for forgiveness. Don't mistake my calm for acceptance, because tonight you showed me who you really are." Margaret looked over at Sarah then, and for the first time that evening, she let the grief show in her eyes. Not weakness, not pity, just the ache of knowing the love you gave was placed in the wrong hands. And when Margaret turned back to face David and Jessica again, she finished with this: "I may be old, but I am not blind, and I am not foolish. You taught me a hard lesson, one I never wanted to learn, but now that I have, I promise you I won't forget." And with that, Margaret turned away, not because she was done feeling, but because she was done explaining. The morning after. The next morning, Margaret woke up earlier than usual. The house was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that soothes you. It was the kind that lingers after something breaks, where even the walls seemed to hold their breath. Margaret stayed in bed for a while listening. She could hear Sarah already moving around in the kitchen, the soft clink of a mug on the counter, the sound of her phone pressed to her ear. Sarah's voice was calm, low, but there was a sharpness to it. The kind of focus that comes when someone has decided they've had enough. Margaret didn't go in. She let Sarah work. She knew by the way Sarah paced, the way she asked short, direct questions that she was getting answers. Sarah was always the one who asked questions nobody wanted to answer. Even as a child, she never let things slide. And now she was doing what needed to be done. Not with fury, but with clarity. By mid-morning, Sarah brought Margaret a cup of tea and sat beside her. She didn't sugarcoat it. She opened her tablet, showed her mother a screen filled with numbers, and told her what she found. $48,000. That's what was missing. Not just gone, but moved, taken bit by bit over months. The payments Sarah had been sending went straight into David's account. From there, they disappeared into purchases, travel, things that had nothing to do with Margaret's needs. Sarah showed her mother the bank statements. Margaret saw the names of stores she'd never been to, restaurants she hadn't stepped foot in, plane tickets, spa treatments. She saw the withdrawals, the transfers, the way the numbers dropped without reason. And Margaret just sat there staring at the proof of something she had felt but never wanted to see laid out so plain. Sarah had already spoken to the bank, put a hold on anything tied to Margaret's name. She had already called her lawyer, an old college friend, and scheduled a meeting. Sarah told her mother not to worry. "We'll fix this, Mom. I promise you we'll fix it." Margaret nodded. She didn't cry. Not because it didn't hurt, but because she was too tired for tears. Tired of doubting herself. Tired of swallowing questions. Tired of wondering if her silence had allowed all of this to happen. And maybe it had. Maybe she'd been too quiet for too long. But not anymore. Margaret let Sarah handle it. She let her dig through papers, call banks, follow trails Margaret never would have known how to follow. Margaret sat by the window, wrapped in her robe, hands folded over one another, watching the leaves move gently in the yard. She let Sarah do what she couldn't, and she didn't feel small for it. She felt something else, something like strength, something like relief. Sarah printed everything out, put it in a folder with Margaret's name on it, and set it on the table. She said Margaret didn't have to open it if she didn't want to. Margaret told her she would, just not yet. She didn't need to see every line to understand the damage. She had already lived it. But what mattered now wasn't what was lost. It was what Margaret wouldn't let go of again. And this time she had someone in her corner, not pretending to help, not playing the part, but truly standing beside her. It didn't take yelling. It didn't take threats. Just truth, steady and clear, spoken by someone who still believed in doing right. And Margaret knew then with quiet certainty that she had given her trust to the wrong person for too long. But she had raised the right one to help her take it back. They left. David and Jessica were gone by the end of the week. Margaret didn't remember if she asked them to leave or if they left on their own. Some endings don't need words. Sometimes the air between people shifts just enough that everyone knows it's time. David didn't look at Margaret when he packed. Jessica moved quietly, eyes low, saying very little, as if words might somehow make it worse. Margaret didn't follow them from room to room, didn't stand in the doorway or ask where they were going. She just sat at the kitchen table, fingers wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold, listening to drawers open and close. When the door shut behind them for the last time, Margaret didn't move. She listened to the sound of silence settle back into the walls. But this time, it didn't feel hollow. It felt clean, like something heavy had been swept out. Margaret exhaled in a way she hadn't in months, maybe years. Her chest, which had been tight for so long she forgot it could be any other way, felt just a little lighter. That same afternoon, Sarah sat with Margaret and they changed the locks. They called the lawyer again. Sarah updated the power of attorney. They made sure everything with Margaret's bank and her name was hers again. Margaret's life, what's left of it, was placed gently back in her hands. And it felt strange, that weight, not overwhelming, just unfamiliar. But she carried it all the same. The next morning, Margaret stood in the kitchen and baked a pie.
Just a small one.
Nothing fancy. Apple with cinnamon, the way she always liked. Her hands moved slow, steady. She found the rhythm again. Margaret cleaned out the pantry, got rid of expired cans, wiped down every shelf like she was brushing out the past. And then she opened the window and let the fresh air move through the house. Margaret sat in the living room with a notebook in her lap. Not the one she used to track her pills, but a new one. Clean, crisp pages. She wrote a memory here, a thought there. Not for anyone else to read, just for her, to remind herself that her voice still had a place, even if it had gone quiet for a while. And when the sun began to set, Margaret stepped out onto the porch. She looked out at the street, empty and peaceful. There were no cars in the driveway, no raised voices behind her, no heaviness hanging from the ceiling, just a light breeze and the quiet sound of her own breathing, steady and unshaken. Margaret smiled, not wide, not for show, just the kind that creeps in when something inside you feels settled again. Not because everything had been fixed, but because something had been reclaimed. Something that had been taken quietly, piece by piece, but now sat whole again in the center of her. And for the first time in a long while, Margaret wasn't waiting for the next bad thing to happen. She was simply there, present, with nothing to hide and nothing left to hand over to people who hadn't earned it. Moving forward, Margaret doesn't hate them. She truly doesn't. But she's learned that forgiveness doesn't mean handing back the keys, especially not to people who use them like crowbars, prying open parts of her life they had no right to touch. Margaret still sleeps with her door locked now, not out of fear, but out of understanding. If your kindness was mistaken for weakness, if someone you trusted took your love without asking, then you know what Margaret means. Margaret is healing now, and she knows she was never truly alone. Not then.
Not now.